Happy Saturday or happy holiday weekend if you're in the United States. It's Memorial Day, and as the top of this weekly newsletter from MMAcycles.com says, a holiday when the nation honors its warriors, those who died while serving in the United States Armed Forces, and markets will be closed in the United States on Monday. Thanks for joining us. We have an important newsletter. There were some cracks that appeared in the market this week, and Ray addresses those. There was also an interesting tweet, if you follow his Twitter page, exactly along the points that we're about to unpack. So if you are in the markets or interested in the markets, and there's some really good astrology included in this week's newsletter as well. Let's get started with some quotes. This is an oldie but goodie from Warren Buffett, as it was quoted by Jason Zweig in the book What Our Brains Know About Stocks But Won't Tell Us, and was published in the Wall Street Journal on Friday. It said, "Attempt to be fearful while others are greedy, and be greedy only when others are fearful." And this from Dr. Paul Donovan in an article entitled The Politics of Economics, which was published in the UBS Weekly blog also on Friday. He said, higher real wages are an antidote to inflation, but voters tend to regard higher pay as the just reward for harder work, not gratuitously higher living standards. If better pay is perceived as the result of personal endeavor, politicians receive no credit. And then a quote from Robert Thibodeau of Mayflower Bookshop, Berkeley, Michigan. He says, "Everything is possible. Nothing is permitted." Now Ray's comments for this week. He says, "We anticipated this would be a wild and chaotic time for financial markets, and indeed it started out that way. The convergence and translation of the Sun and Venus over the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in the money sign of Taurus corresponded to a sudden and sharp reversal in many financial markets last week, including equities and precious metals. Both of these sectors made new all-time or multi-year highs last week, then experienced sudden reversals to the downside. Is this a sign of trouble ahead as Jupiter starts its one-year trek through the volatile and changeable sign of Gemini?" In last week's column, we asked, how long can this euphoria and bullish behavior last? With the emphasis in Taurus, traders and investors are prone to be complacent. That may be an unwise choice of activity, as the convergence of all the planetary benefics in Taurus is coming to an end. End quote from last week. Last week, we got an initial trigger that something is brewing in these markets. Bitcoin and Ethereum may be the exception. There is no confirmation yet that the gong has been rung on these bull markets. You seldom hear the gong or realize the gong has been rung until the panic sets in. I'm just going to insert an aside here. If you're on Twitter, this would be a really good time to pause this and go look at his comment on Twitter this past week about the 4-year cycles. It correlates right to what he's saying here and gives you more insight on this comment. Yet, he says, the behavior of the markets last week is typical of how bull markets often behave near their end. There can be false breakouts initially, but when the stock indices are this late in their 4-year cycle, every bearish trigger has to be respected as a possible gong ringer. For example, over 90% of 4-year U.S. stock market cycles, all the way back to 1893, have topped out by their 49th month. May is the 50th month since the 4-year cycle began with the COVID-19 pandemic panic of March 2020. Furthermore, the 4-year cycle trough has occurred by the 56th month in over 90% of those cases. Thus, the U.S. stock market is due for both a crest and a trough within the next 6 months, and the crest will happen first. Now, the short-term geocosmics, starting off with a quote from Ray Dalio in Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises, published by Bridgewater in 2018. He says that credit is the giving of buying power. The buying power is granted in exchange for a promise to pay it back, which is debt. The question of whether rapid credit debt growth is a good or bad thing hinges in what the credit produces and how the debt is repaid, i.e., how the debt is serviced." End quote. Here is a quote from the Wall Street Journal editorial board back on Wednesday. Commissioner Danny Werfel appeared before the House Appropriations Committee recently and told legislators that the IRS faces financial collapse. In other words, the IRS doesn't think the $60 billion bonus it received from Congress in 2022 is enough, though it is supposed to last through 2031. The IRS has a brilliant solution for this cash burn: to add more to the pile. Instead of explaining where the money went, Mr. Werfel asked the House to look away and grant his team another massive funding boost, this time through 2034. Now, Ray's comments, he says, so the question pertinent to that last quote is, did the $60 billion credit, i.e. bonus, given to the IRS produce anything of value for the debt incurred? For that matter, is anything of lasting value, as in an investment, being created for all the debt the governments of the world, especially in the U.S., are taking on? Or at what point does this debt explosion, without a comparable and ideally more favorable return of value, result in an economic crisis? We have discussed the history of the Jupiter-Uranus 14-year synodic cycle and its correlation to highs in the stock markets 1 to 7 months afterwards, and usually 1 to 4 months afterwards. That cycle began when the conjunction took place on April 20th. We are now well into the 1 to 4 month aftermath when new highs usually occur, and as of last week, they have. However, there is another important long-term cycle to discuss, known as the first 1/8 phase, or harmonic, of the 32 to 37-year Saturn-Pluto cycle that is also now underway from May 6th, 2024 to January 26th of 2025. Why is this important? Firstly, the first 1/8 phase is the, quote, abort stage of the cycle that starts with the conjunction. It's a time when one reflects back upon decisions made and new directions that were initiated during the time of the conjunction. Those decisions are now tested, and another decision to either continue in that direction or to abort is demanded. Secondly, Saturn-Pluto has to do with debt and credit. It correlates well with the interest rate cycle when central banks either tighten or loosen monetary policy, which in turn affects financial markets. The conjunction of Saturn and Pluto occurred on January 12, 2020. Within a month, the stock market had topped out, and the coronavirus pandemic crisis erupted, which led to extremely accommodative monetary and governmental stimulus policies as the stock market tanked. The nation's debt skyrocketed. In fact, the debt of many nations skyrocketed then and was a primary cause of the soaring inflation that followed a year later throughout the world. Central banks were late, but they finally started increasing interest rates to fight inflation. Now the Fed and other central banks of the world are reviewing those decisions in light of the fact that worldwide debt has continued to explode despite the comparatively high interest rates, but it does seem to be pulling the pace of inflation down. However, there is another subtle geocosmic issue that may be involved here. Saturn and Pluto conjoining can also coincide with a black swan event that suddenly destabilizes markets. No one likes to or even can consistently predict a black swan event. Yet this is often the case when the market has its first 1/8 subcycle, or harmonic, underway of a longer-term planetary cycle, especially one involving Saturn, Uranus, and/or Pluto with one another. Remember, the first 1/8 harmonic, the semi-square, of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle occurred in 2022, just before Russia invaded Ukraine and started the seeds of a possible World War III. Parentheses, Ray says, yes, I know many believe the United States and NATO started this war by not honoring their agreements made in 1989 and 90. But he says this Saturn-Pluto aspect is more of a true black swan event possibility because the conjunction coincided with an unexpected generational pandemic, as well as the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, which could have started a world war as well. During that period, the U.S. stock market fell nearly 40% in 1 month, and the economy fell into a sudden, sharp, but short-lived recession. At the same time, the U.S. took on huge new debt in the form of drastic new stimulus packages and prolonged, too long, monetary easing measures. The first 1/8 phase, or 45 degrees, of a planetary cycle is when similar themes return that were present during the conjunction period. It could be magnified this time because a 4-year stock market cycle, or low, is also due during this planetary phase. We're also coming to the end of favorable Jupiter transiting aspects with a trine to Pluto next weekend, June 2nd. From there, Jupiter will begin its march toward the 3-passage series of square aspects to Saturn, occurring in August 2024 through June 2025. It's a different collective psychology than the soft and euphoric aspects that Jupiter has been expressing with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. With hard aspects involving Saturn, it is probably wise to be prepared and have a plan. Regarding trading and investing, I find it smarter to risk protecting oneself too early rather than too late. I also find with Jupiter, in any aspect to Saturn, that wise people are more apt to be cautious than reckless. A constructive plan for the future would be to make sure you have plenty of cash to buy goods, such as stocks and perhaps commodities, when they are offered at more affordable prices, along the lines of the Warren Buffett quote given at the beginning of this week's column. And that concludes our newsletter for this week, and I would just add a comment that basically this is a newsletter to study. If you don't understand what he said, especially in the second half, the short-term Geocosmics section, it would be worth going back and listening to and even calling up on the website, MMAcycles.com, and click at the top link is the free weekly newsletter, to understand what he's saying here, because this could affect the collective as well. And if you're in the newsletter, if you choose to go there, check out the announcements section as well. Some cool stuff, including a new app that they've come out with at MMAcycles.com. Have a great rest of the Memorial Day weekend. Wishing you the very, very best, and I will see you on Monday for next week's Fun Astrology podcast. Have a great one. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.